Welcome, bienvenidos everyone to UCEA 34th Annual Convention. This is the last of our general pre-sessions and our annual town hall sponsored by the Wallace Foundation. I know that you're in for a thoughtful and powerful discussion among system leaders across the country. I am Monica Byrne Jimenez, and I'm proud to be the Executive Director of UCEA. It has been a year full of challenges for all of us, as individuals, as UCEA, and as a nation. In the past 10 months, I've come to truly rely on the kindness, not of strangers, but of our UCEA community. I know that our convention is a little different this year and that we are not together in the same physical space and place. But I know that by being in the same virtual space, we create a place that it can be as connected, as human as if we were together. I want to thank you for being here and helping to create that special UCEA place. I'm coming today from East Lansing, Michigan, and our new home at Michigan State University. And because space and place is important, I want to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In doing so, I affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences of those Indigenous individuals and communities, and I affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. I also want to take a moment to recognize that many in our communities and some listening here today have experienced or are experiencing hardship and loss because of COVID-19. I want you to know that I hold you, that we hold you in our hearts, and that we as a UCEA familia are holding you close as you navigate these difficult times. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you enjoyed today's panel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the convention. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Yanira Oliveras Ortiz from the University of Texas at Tyler and member of this year's planning committee. From Puerto Rico, Dr. Oliveras Ortiz was, I know, excited to plan for UCEA in San Juan, and not being there is especially hard for her. She, along with the rest of the planning committee, have done a fabulous job of creating this convention, and I'm so grateful for their energy, generosity, and fearlessness as we put this convention together. Yanira, thank you so much for all your hard work this year, and it's been wonderful working with you.
Thank you, Monica. And on behalf of the President-elect Bill Black and the Planning Committee, I want to thank you, Monica, for all your leadership and thank the Wallace Foundation for their continued support of UCEA. It is my pleasure to introduce the panel moderator and the four superintendents on the panel. Our moderator is Denisa Superville. Denisa Superville is an assistant editor at Education Week, where she focuses on principals and school leadership. She joined Education Week in 2014, initially as a reporter covering district news, management, and leadership. Before joining Education Week, Superville worked as a reporter at The Record in Bergen County, New Jersey. Today, we have four panelists. Dr. Joseph Davis. Dr. Davis began serving the Ferguson-Florissant School District as superintendent on July 1st, 2015. Dr. Davis began his teaching career in the Wayne County Public School in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He taught middle school mathematics before joining the staff at R.L. Fike High School in Wilson, North Carolina, as a math teacher. It was during his time at Fike that Dr. Davis decided to shift his graduate work focus from mathematics to school administration at East Carolina University. He began his administrative career as an assistant principal in the Nash Rocky Mount School District at Parker Middle School, then returned to Wilson County Schools to serve as an assistant principal at E.T. Bedingfield High School, his alma mater. After completing his coursework at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he served a stint as the executive director of student services in Wilson County Schools before taking on the principalship at Darren Vick Middle School. While at Darren Vick, he was part of the process to secure a bond referendum from the county to build a new middle school, Charles D. Darden Middle. Then, shortly after converting from Darting Vic into an elementary school, Samuel L. Vic Elementary, in which he had the privilege of serving both schools respectively. He also served as principal of James B. Hunt High School and as a special assistant to the superintendent in Wilson County Schools. Dr. Davis became superintendent of the Washington County School Districts on September 17th, 2012, where he joined where he served until joining FFSD in 2015. A graduate of Bedingfield High School in Wilson, North Carolina, Dr. Davis attended North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in Computer Science. After receiving his teaching license through East Carolina University, Dr. Davis continued at ECU, earning a Master of School Administration degree and an Educational Specialist degree. Afterwards, he earned a second master's degree in education and a doctorate in administration, planning, and social policy, both from Harvard University Grad School of Education. Dr. Davis, his wife Latanya, and their son Joseph live in Ferguson. Joseph is a student in the Ferguson-Florissant School District. Welcome, Dr. Davis. Pam Doyen has served in rural Maine education since 1987. She started as a teacher, became a literacy specialist, transitioned to an elementary school principal, and is currently serving as the superintendent of RSU 56 and principal of DeRigo High School. Pam earned a Bachelor of Science in K-8 education from the University of Maine at Farmington, a Master's of Science in Literacy from the University of Southern Maine, a CAS in Educational Leadership from the University of Southern Maine, and a PhD in Educational Leadership from the University of Maine. Pam is married and has 4 adult children. She enjoys all things outdoors, walking, hiking, kayaking, and biking, to name a few. Welcome, Pam. Dr. Michael Hinojosa. Dr. Michael Hinojosa has served for over 25 years as a superintendent and CEO of 6 public education systems, including 2 of the 25 largest school systems in America: the Dallas ISD, the Dallas Independent School District in Texas, and the Colby County School District in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. His career in public education, from teacher and coach to superintendent CEO, spanned more than 4 decades. With a firm belief that education and not environment is key to student success, he has led several school districts to improve student achievement. Dr. Hinojosa recognitions include being named 2002 Superintendent of the Year by the Texas Association of School Boards and 2005 Superintendent of the Year by the University of Texas at Austin. He was honored as a distinguished alumnus by the College of Education at Texas Tech University and as the Outstanding Latino Educator by the Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents in 2014. In 2019, D Magazine named him the best public official in Dallas. He is a past president of the Texas Association of School Administrators. Dr. Hinojosa, a proud graduate of Dallas ISD, holds a doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin. He and his wife, Kitty, have 2 sons, graduates of Princeton University and Harvard University. He has a son from a previous marriage who graduated from Texas Tech University. All 3 attended Dallas ISD for a significant portion of their K-12 career. Welcome, Dr. Hinojosa. And then, last but not, Wendell Waukau. I'm sorry if I made it. Is that right? Waukau. Wendell Waukau is currently the superintendent of Menominee Indian School District. Menominee Indian School District is located on the Menominee. Oh my gosh, I hate mispronouncing things. Menominee Indian Reservation in northeast Wisconsin and serves approximately 1,000 students in grades 4K through 12. Wendell is an enrolled member of the Menominee Indian tribe in Wisconsin and considers it both a privilege and an honor to work and serve in the community he grew up. For 31 years, Wendell has served MISD and his community as a teacher, coach, athletic director, dean of students, principal, and now superintendent. Once labeled a dropout factory for graduating less than 60% of students on time, MISD has successfully implemented various reforms, initiatives in the area of community and family engagement, mentoring, early childhood, social emotional learning, nutrition and wellness, trauma-informed care and resiliency, restorative practices, which have led to present-day graduation rate of 90%. In 2012, Wendell was honored at the White House under President Obama's administration and as a school turnaround champion of change. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be part of this panel and part of the 2020 UCEA convention. Now I turn it over to Denisa, our moderator.
Thank you for that introduction, Monica and Janira. I also want to welcome everyone who's following online. We're hoping to have a really robust discussion today about the challenges and opportunities that district leaders are facing right now amid the coronavirus pandemic and this national conversation we're having about racial justice and racial equality. We have a diverse panel, as you can see, and we're going to hear from leaders, including rural school district leaders that are often left out of the conversation sometimes when we're talking about equity. So we look forward to learning from each other as districts navigate this incredibly difficult time that we're having right now. So I just wanted to start with just like an open question to our panelists. For context, to help those who are listening, can you tell us a little bit about your districts? We can start with Pam, if that's okay.
That's certainly fine with me. So I serve in a little district, RSU 56. We're 4 towns in Western Maine. We're approximately 90 minutes northwest of Portland, which is typically a place that most people recognize in Maine. We have 60% or more of our kids typically are free and reduced. The average household income ranges from a low of $29,000 in one town to $56,000 in my most affluent town. We have mostly convenience stores. We do have one hardware store and a mill yard in one of our towns, but we basically have no places of work. People have to travel elsewhere to go to their jobs. We have approximately 750 students pre-K to 12 and about 160 staff who service those students. We are predominantly white. We have less than 2% people of color or other ethnicities here in our 4 towns. RSU 56 withdrew from a larger district 4 years ago, which I think is significant. They wanted to remain the Derigo Cougars. There was a lot of pride in voting for the withdrawal with Save the Cougars and Save Derigo signs and stickers everywhere. However, since that time, they've come to realize that footing the bill for a small district is quite challenging. And the budget has been a consistent problem over our 4 years, with 1 year taking 5 votes to get a budget passed. So it was January before we had a budget for the school year. During that budget process, I, who was serving as superintendent and administrative assistant to the superintendent, became the high school principal as well. And we have many other roles that have taken on multiple roles in order to fill the needs in the district. So we feel like we have support of the town philosophically, but budgetary, it's quite a problem in a rural Maine school. So that kind of sums up where we are in RSU 56.
Thanks for starting us off.
You're welcome.
Dr. Davis, do you want to tell us a little bit about your school district?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm in Ferguson-Florissant School District. Most people know it as Ferguson, and what happened back in 2014 with the killing of Michael Brown. I've been here. I actually came on the heels of that event. I actually applied for this job because of what happened then. I consider myself as an equity warrior for all children, but especially Black children, because those are the groups in most districts in this country that are undereducated. including many others, white alike. So we are about 11,000 students. We have 22 schools. And, we've done a lot of work over the this is my 6th year here. I had to do a lot of work with our community because of the sort of division that we know is evident. We're in a pandemic, but the racism pandemic has been here. And that's certainly an issue that we are often having conversations about. I'm proud of some of the work that we've done, all of the work we've done, but more work that we need to do. But one of the things I'm most proud of is our relationship with the City of Ferguson and the police chief in Ferguson. We've done some really good work with him, the new police chief, and other parts of the community. I think all of us would agree that schools are an outgrowth of communities, and your schools are strong when your communities are strong. I think it goes hand in hand. We have opened up a couple of STEAM schools that children have to apply to get into. We've got approved for an international baccalaureate program at one of our high schools. We have a particular interest in making sure students are getting ready for math and science careers. That's why we started the STEAM schools. And so we take that work all the way back to our pre-K2 to 3-5 elementary schools. But excited to be a part of the work. I think we've really just begun to crack the egg, if you will. But I'm looking forward to the road ahead for Ferguson.
Thank you. Wendell.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about Menominee Indian School District. It's located on the Menominee Indian Reservation, as I mentioned before. What I always like to mention whenever I talk is that I'm very proud that the Menominee Nation we are considered Wisconsin's oldest continuous residents, as not many tribes across Indian country can attest to the fact that their origin exists in their present reservation. Okay, we shrunk a little bit, but we're still here. We never left. And so it was back, I think, in 1976 when our school district was established, and it was actually established as kind of like a seceding from a local school district 10 miles down the road, which I attended back in the 80s. And it was formed because of a lack of cultural sensitivity and racism and prejudice, and it was a tough time. But what it's allowed us to do is, we're unique in that we're a public school district located entirely on an Indian reservation. And what that means is it gives us the opportunity to teach our language, our history, our culture, that recognizes the importance in what our ancestors have done for us. But what it does is it really strengthens the identity of our children, and it also promotes equity across our entire district. And we're over 1,000 students, 98% Native American. Okay, and 88% of our kids qualify for free and reduced meals. Our school board makes it real easy. We just feed everybody. Nobody has to fill out those forms because everybody eats free. And I really applaud our school board for doing that. But we have an elementary school, we have a middle school, we have a high school, and then it was about 4 years ago when we started our work around trauma. We developed our own student health center right on campus. But if you came here, our school is unique in that it's got the community concept. You walk into our elementary school, you see a dental chair in there, you see an optical chair. And again, our way of doing this is that, we know that just given the amount of time that kids spend in schools, and I think research will tell you maybe it's about 14% of their time, it's so important that time outside of school, you bring those resources in. So our pledge is, we need to bring the school community into our school. So, I guess just in that, I'm very honored that I can still work in a community that I grew up in, even though I've had chances to leave. But I'm going to stay here and I'm going to finish it out, and I'm going to make sure that when I turn it over to the next generation of leaders, which I'm already grooming, and they are Native, I'm also happy to say that in 2003, when I became a superintendent, we were sitting here with 13% of Native teachers, and it's taken 17, 18 years to get to 40% Native American teachers in our school district, which I think is great, and we're not done yet. But then I took it a step further, and now I've got principals that are Native, and that's kind of my push, is that, because I know I won't be here forever, but this has to continue, and I think the leaders in our community have to be from this community. So thank you.
No, thank you. I love that you started talking about what equity means in your district, which gets us to the second thing we wanted to talk about. Since you all operate in different contexts, I was wondering whether you can talk a little bit about what systemic inequities have been revealed or heightened in the wake of the COVID pandemic or the racial loss. And, how have you addressed those on an individual level and a systemic level? And anyone can go first.
Well, I'll jump in. I think that the bigger issues for me has been around academic outcomes for students. And when I look at it from the student level, I think it's really what has been laid bare are the inequities that Black children in our community in particular, and the quality of education that they have not been getting and so desperately need. There's a difference between getting grades and mastering standards. And that has been quite evident that our students are further behind than what I could have imagined. And the nice part about it is that we're putting some structures in place so that we begin teaching standards in ways that kids master that content versus just making a grade. For example, you can't, get an A in calculus for bringing in extra, an assigned paper or assigned paper by your parent, just as an example, if you will. Not that that always happens, but it is really important to make sure that children are learning the content, and that has been laid bare for me when I have conversations with teachers. When I'm in calls, we're still 100% virtual, and that's presented a challenge because learning and teaching is really important when you're talking about students actually mastering that content. So we've begun to have conversations around what standards-based grading looks like. How do we implement that in our schools? So when teachers are teaching content, they're teaching it so that students master that versus just making a grade. I think grades are signals, but they don't always tell you what children know. And so where we've sort of turned our focus to is how do we ensure deep learning? How do we ensure all of our students get deep learning? And I think that putting these structures in place to assess the losses that they've experienced since March, if you will, until now, and then how do we begin to fill those gaps that we know are there? I think one thing that's helping us is as we look at data differently, we've taken away the sort of data that adapts because kids often get content under grade level versus where they ought to be. You can't do calculus if you haven't mastered algebra. And so we have some really good assessments in place, an assessment tool that really sort of garners whether kids have learned the content. And then we're supporting teachers to make sure that they have the tools they need to give students what they need. Teacher content knowledge in mathematics in particular is something that I'm very passionate about, and we're pushing that to the elementary schools. So it's sort of laid out where kids are or are not when it comes to their content mastery, and then how do we begin to respond to that? To me, that's equity at its finest, because when we think about racism and all of the inequities that are in our societies, from housing to banking and so many other structural sort of barriers that are there, education to me is the through line. And if we can guarantee that students get a high quality education, that they've mastered content, that they can use that content to create new knowledge, then to me, that's the marker for deep learning. And so that's, something that has been shown for us in this pandemic, and we hope will help us to sort of propel us further as we move forward.
I would say two clear areas have come into focus for RSU 56 in the last 10 months. The first being the underlying racial culture, and that's I think we're somewhat insulated in many ways because, as I said, we're like 98% plus white, but we do have students of color here, and I think we thought things were fine. And then I started hearing from students that were choosing to stay virtual even when we came back to school because they, quote, never wanted to walk back into my school. And I've only been principal since last October, and we went out in March. So I didn't have a lot of work and relationships with a lot of these students, but in follow-up one-on-one conversations, the things that were said to them, the injustices that they endured under really this whole white culture that was pretty prevalent in our schools was really hard for me to hear. We did a survey of current and past students and community members and got a lot of data on things that were happening in our school that a lot of the adults, and honestly we're 100% basically white staff here, were really unaware of or unwilling to address. So we've been doing a lot of work with Seeds of Peace and Civility, having the administrative team read White Fragility, having two of our previous students, both of color, are willing to serve on our ARC committee. So that's anti-racist curriculum committee that we're working on. They come to one administrative team meeting a month, and we go through some of the survey data and we talk about like how we should have reacted, what we could have been doing, how can we support students and keep this from happening. So I think in some ways, because of the pandemic and because obviously of the unrest across the nation, that's been brought to a forefront and in really rural Maine areas where, again, we're predominantly white and a little bit insulated. Secondly, through the pandemic and having to go totally remote learning from March to the end of the school year, it became increasingly evident of the socioeconomic disparities in this rural area. We had many, many families who either did not have internet, could not afford internet, really could not connect to their instructional practices that we were providing. We did have one-to-one laptop devices, which we deployed, but we also ended up getting hotspots for kids because their parents couldn't afford to have internet. And additionally, it became evident as we were delivering school meals that we had families, really hungry families in our communities. So we started going, we sent the van once a week down to about an hour and a half away to get to the food bank. We brought back food bank food and started feeding our families, not just families with students in our communities, but elderly and other people that were calling in saying they were hungry and didn't have the access to go get food or to felt comfortable to go out and get food. So we really started being a bigger service than just education and school nutrition. We served food. We brought personal hygiene products. We really became a social service agent in this area, in large part because there aren't any available. Like the school became the everything for our community in terms of delivering what they needed. So I think those two things have become really clear and part of our focused conversations around how do we support the racial inequities and how do we support the social economic disparities that we're seeing in our districts.
And thanks, Pam, because that's probably a good segue to what I had written down here was around this whole socio-economic disparities. So, last year, March 13th, it just will always ring in my calendar because that's when we said goodbye to our kids. And we said, don't worry, we'll see you back in April. Well, we didn't. And we still haven't seen them because we're still virtual. And so we were doing what 420 other school districts in the state of Wisconsin were being told to do is, okay, now you got to go virtual. And we're like, okay, so we are going to go virtual in our socioeconomic status where many of our students don't have broadband access. They don't have a computer, much less a parent or a caregiver who can help them navigate this. Teachers who haven't been trained in Google Classroom. And a decision was made that that's not what we're going to do. we are going to feed our kids, just like as Pam pointed out, and we provided meals to our community on a regular basis. And then we took the time to say, all right, how can we find out more about the needs of our kids? Because yes, we bought a Chromebook for every kid. Okay, we put Wi-Fi on our buses. We bought over 100, almost 200 hotspots that we've got out into the community. And then thinking about teachers. And I couldn't even imagine a teacher being told, okay, in 2 weeks, you got it ready to teach virtual. We weren't going to put that on our teachers. So we used that time when they would come in, and we did a lot of work virtually around training in Google Classroom. So they got to get that all set up for the start of the year, and I'm glad that was helpful. But we spent more time last spring staying in touch with our kids, whether it was a phone call or whether it was a text or Facebook messages. Hello, how you doing? We miss you. Hey, when food was here, it was an opportunity to at least have a short conversation. And I'm so glad we did that, because I think even though we're struggling now, had we done what we're doing now back in March, I think we'd be sitting here with even a bigger problem. So I'm thankful for that. And of course, we still have a lot more work to go, especially as we're hoping to bring our kids back in January. And then that gets us to what were we working on before March? And it was about changing accountability around student behavior, because suspensions don't work. And I'll talk more about that later, but that's where we were trying to flip the script in changing the accountability with students by having the consequence come at the end and not at the beginning. And that's where we were working with our teachers. And that's why we talk about restorative practices, where it isn't about what rules are broken, it's about what relationships were broken and what has to be repaired. And I think I'm excited when we do get to come back in person, we'll be picking that work back up.
Wendell, I was wondering whether you can go a little bit further and talk about, what equity means in your context, especially in the pandemic, running a school running a district where 90% or more of the students are Native American. When you think about equity there, like what does that mean to you? What would you want other districts to know about how equity plays out where you are?
Well, I always think about, equity when I look at our kids. And first of all, the one thing we always want people to understand is our kids ain't broke and they don't need to be fixed. Okay. They need support. They need resources. And so when I think about equity in our Native population, of course, you think about how kids are spread out in our reservation of 234,000 acres. We have 4 different townships. Well, out of those 4 townships, 2 of them have the ability for stores and technology and things like that, where the others are farther away. They don't have access. So if we open up a place for meals, well, 2 of the communities are 7-8 miles away. They can get here. Well, what about the one that's 25-30 miles away? How are they going to get here? So I think part of what we did then is we said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put food on those buses, and we're going right to the community, and we will take the food right to the community. And I think that was something how we looked at. We're also very concerned about our special needs population, because about 25% of our kids have some kind of IEP service. And so like one of them, a big need that we have is around speech. And we're like, how are we going to get speech services to our kids who need it? It's in their IEP. And of course, you give it to a team, you give it to these champions, and they can always come up with something better than you can. And what they did is we said, okay, we have a student health center. What prevents us from bringing those kids to our health center, and they can get that speech therapy on speechtherapy.com? They'll do it here. So again, it's always different looking at equity within a community that has always been fighting for equity, but now we're all one together. And I think sometimes it's it's a challenge, but boy, when we can work together and knock down some of those barriers, we seem to do pretty well.
Now, you've each touched on this as schools and districts being like anchors in the community, serving as community hubs. And wondering what kind of challenges you face now, given that there's this sort of distance, right? Either you're hybrid or fully remote. There's a distance from school buildings, or in the past months, there was some distance from school buildings. And what has surprised you about community during that period?
So I think for me, it's okay, I don't mind starting. So I think for me, the distance piece, we felt like we worked really hard. We're back in school now, which is great. We were out from March to September, but we're back in. But during the time that we were out, we worked hard at finding ways to keep our students and communities connected to us. We did a Derigo version of the Masked Singer. So different teachers were singing and students were guessing who it was. And we did like a home run derby where kids could come one at a time and scores, and we had it on live stream so people could watch. We did a lot of postcards. We did a lot of calling. We had all of the teachers call their students at least once a week. If students were not answering or parents were not answering, myself and the other administrators would follow up. We did visits to homes. We worked really hard for them to know that we were here and caring about them. I do think that our families responded well to that, but our biggest challenge became disappearing students. There are students through this pandemic that have literally disappeared. We have no contact with them. They don't, if we go to the house, it appears somebody still lives there, but they don't answer the door. They're not enrolled in our virtual or our in-person learning. The state has been working with us because our October 1st counts were really kind of quirky with students that are not accounted for. And it's really disconcerting to me to have kids unaccounted for. And then even some of our kids that are accounted for, we have huge truancy issues from all grade levels during that have selected virtual learning. So they're not showing up for virtual learning. They're not interacting with their teachers. They're not submitting work. And we've had meetings after meetings on truancy issues at this point. So I think that's been surprising to me, the disappearing and the truancy rate. As a parent myself, I would have thought I would have want my kid to stay connected, but it seems like some families have really just kind of fallen off the radar and disconnected to schools and to all of our outreach possibilities.
So
yeah, I would echo that. I think for us, when I think about the distance that we're experiencing now, because we're still virtual as well, what has been exposed to me has been the food insecurities that some of you have already spoken about, that sometimes you can get far removed. I grew up, we had challenges growing up, in the South. I'm from North Carolina, and like many places, we have folks who struggle. And when you look at where some of our families are in 2020, it just opens up our eyes, because sometimes we can forget about what children face, what challenges they face even before they get to school. So if we're seeing this now in this pandemic, then we also know that when children come to us every day, that they're having these same struggles, and we try to educate the child without taking care of who the child is, right? Like, there's some really important mental health needs that I think have to be attended to. We had a panel recently with a young lady. She was so well-spoken, not that she wouldn't be, but she just knocked it out of the park for an 8th grader. And she spoke about therapy. And then she specifically spoke to her peers on the panel discussion. And she spoke to it from a Black woman's perspective as an 8th grader. And she said that, in the Black community, we have this stigma around therapy, and that is, not something that we do. And she just encouraged her peers to get therapy. She talked about her conversations with her therapist. Those mental health needs are really important because it's hard to feel safe, not just physically, but mentally and socially, if you don't get the kind of support that you need. And I think this distance that we have now between our families has, again, laid that bare for us. And the need is so much greater. And so we're pushing really hard to try to make sure that students are getting the kind of supports that they need in our community at large. Because I do think that, as you said, schools are anchors. And what has, to me, been surprising in some ways is the level of empathy and the support that we're getting from families that struggle and families who have resources. So we often look at and we divide ourselves, right? Like we look at our country is divided, you know, when we look at politics and so many other things. But tragedy and travesty comes our way, like the pandemic, we show up as humans. And that has been really nice to see Black folks, white folks, all folks coming together, you know, transgender, whomever you are, the thing that we share and encourage, it provides hope and some joy that I appreciate as a, you know, a seasoned educator. Having done this for 27 years, you know, some days when I learn from our students, I feel like I just started teaching all over again. So I'm grateful for the challenges that we face here recently, but I'm also looking forward to us returning in January so that we can, you know, take it to the next level.
Okay, and I actually, this question kind of gave me a, you know, as Joseph said, it gave me some hope, and especially because of mental health. And, you know, I think one of our biggest challenges is kids would come into our schools in person, and before they walked into school, they were greeted by an adult. I mean, Monday mornings, I greet elementary kids, high five, slides. I mean, and then once they're greeted, they get another greeting, and then they're fed, and then they go to class. And the very first thing we do is we have a morning mood check-in. And, you know, kids, elementary kids, I'll just use an example. You know, they go to the whiteboard and they see their name and they drop it in a car. And if it's in the front seat, they're ready to go, smiley face. If they put it in the back seat, well, maybe they're struggling a little bit, but they're doing okay. But if they come in and they take that face and they put it in a trunk, that means they're not good. And you'd be surprised of how we were able to intervene when kids were in the trunk to avoid bigger blowups down the end. And when we missed out on that, I think our teachers and our administrators just like, who's checking in with them at home? What happens when they're in the trunk at home? Who's looking after them? And I think that connection, of course, trying to, you know, to call them, you know, Google, Zoom, home visits, it's just not the same. You know, and last week I was on a Zoom meeting with all these superintendents in our area, and I was jealous because the elementary school had a Halloween drive-up. I'm not kidding you. It looked like the first day of school. There was cars, all teachers lined up, and just, it was amazing. And I'm like, that's what we build up, you know. And so now, you know, as we've opened up our distant learning support centers, in which we're bringing kids and families in, although it's in a gymnasium, we're reconnecting. And what today from my principals is, Wendell, if now we can just give them a little extra. Well, what do you need in a little extra? Well, you know, we send food with them home every day. And what we actually do is we take meals on our buses and we just take the normal school route. And the buses drive the food off in a cooler, in a box, and they just leave it and they go, but it's hot meals and it's 4 times a week. Well, when the kids come into the school, because of food insecurity, which I think my panelists here have mentioned, well, what do we tell them? Well, I'm sorry, but your food is at home. No, we're going to tell the cooks, you know what, you make some extra food and we feed them. And because now we're greeting them with smiles. And just what I heard today from the principals about the data that was involved. And now as we go into next week and say, all right, how are we going to get better next week? It's like, okay, now let's get some of that social emotional learning in. Let's get these kids moving around. And to me, I think it's given me some hope, as I think, as Joseph mentioned, is that it's so important before we get back to academics. We must reconnect with our kids and their families.
Larger question about changing the system. This was an unprecedented time for every single school district in the country. And, you know, when things like this happen, people think about revamping and reinventing and making better, right? So how do you create an educational system that disrupts the inequality and serves students from communities that are right now being hard hit by COVID, unemployment, or a resource challenge? And what advice would you offer to other system leaders? Especially, how do you support building principals who are kind of critical in messaging district communication to families?
Well, you know, I'll say that we are forever changed with this experience, and we will never be the same, right? And you know, we too have gone one-to-one. So every one of our students has a device, whether it be one we've given them or one they already had, and probably 98% of them got them from us. Every child's connected. Still have a few connectivity issues, but we have enough hotspots, and we know our students are connected. So those are infrastructure now, right? Like they have to be in place. But virtual learning will forever be a part of our DNA. And you know, I heard Pam say earlier, some students want to stay on virtual. They don't want to go back to coming into buildings for whatever reason. And that's not a bad thing. In fact, I think it's an opportunity for students who have left our district, maybe gone to a private school or done homeschooling. So I think that, you know, education has changed, and I have this term that I don't lay claim to it, but I've heard it, and I totally agree with it, and it's called education on demand, right? Like how do we create the structures so that students can learn at any time, whether it be not just 8 to 3 as we open our doors or our Zooms, but whenever, because you know, I think there's some opportunity in providing students the education that they need when they need it. And so what that looks like, I don't fully know. I can guess my way, not really, I could design my way through it, I guess, if you will. But I also think that our leaders have to be learners. So how will principals and how have they, and are they being impacted by this? I was on a call just before this one with a group of my principals. And I spend a lot of time with principals. And while I don't directly supervise them, because I have principal supervisors who do that work, I think it's important that I spend time with them, because having been a principal for years, and teaching and learning is my passion, we have to redesign the way we've been delivering learning to students, right? And so we have to be learners ourselves. And that's been exciting because it's pushed our principals to a different level, to really think about, what does learning look like? You can still do walkthroughs in your building. You can still, do coaching and support in a virtual space. They do virtual walks now, and then design our way through what coaching looks like in that space. So I think education will be changed forever for the better, because not only can students learn on demand, but teachers as well, and principals and other of those who support teachers in schools. That we have to be learners, and we have to figure out how to deliver learning in ways that kids need it the most. And I also think that when we talk about achievement gaps, like, Wendell said this earlier, there's nothing wrong with our kids. When I think about the achievement gap, there ain't nothing wrong with Black kids. When it comes to the Black-white achievement gap, what the issue is, and I've heard this often, is the opportunity to have the kind of quality in front of them every day. And then that we ensure they get the kind of learning they need every year. No child should leave our schools and not be guaranteed at least one unit of education every year. That's one unit of education. And when they do, we fail them. So I think that we have enough technology, enough science, and enough will, and we have to summons that will and make sure that no child gets left behind. I know that's a cliche, but it is true. And I think that we're in right now has given us the opportunity to see the possibility. And it's going to take us to the next level. I'll end by saying this part. that our parents have been incredible during this time, right? Like parents, they become the teacher, and it's changed the way they how their children get learning, education. So they are thought partners now at the table, and see full well what it takes for their kindergartner or their fifth grader or their senior to get the kind of quality of education that they need. And parents have been calling it out. Wait a minute, this is not, or this is not. And then those conversations are opened up, and that communication line is something that I think has been a difference maker when teachers and parents talk about the student. And so I think we will be forever changed because of this experience.
I would agree with you, Dr. Davis. I think the most exciting an exciting part of the fact that we've been forced to change. I think the institution of public schools has been somewhat archaic, very difficult to pivot and change and meet the modern day needs of our students. And it's a bit apropos to say in this situation, we've been building the plane as we fly it, and we're finding out that we can teach and learn differently than what we thought we could. It is no longer a situation where teachers can really stand and lecture and students regurgitate information. It doesn't work through learning that way. It hasn't really in classrooms that way for quite some time. I think our teachers and our families are working together, and we're seeing how generation of students learns best, and we're adding that to our repertoire. And I think that we are forever changed. I think that's the one blessing of this pandemic, is that the idea of public school will change. And I think we will be offering virtual classes. We will be offering opportunities for kids to do a Google Classroom at home in the evenings, and that's the best time for them. I think our whole idea of what public education is and looks like has been changed. And I do think that's a positive, and I think in the long run, it's going to make us better in all of our public schools.
You know, Joseph and Pam talk about the education on demand and the redesign of learning and building the plane while we fly it. Oh, today in our admin meeting, we were discussing grading because our teachers are struggling with how to grade kids virtually. You know, and first of all, we decided we are not going to plane. We'll build a plane, but we'll build it on the ground. We're not going to build it while we fly it because that's just not safe. Okay, but I think what we're encountering is teachers, and again, that's on us because we supervise them. Is let's just go back to the way we used to do things. And the thing is, yeah, but why do we want to go back to the way we were doing working before? You know, can you imagine? I told him, I said, I probably wouldn't be a very good student today, especially in high school, if I had to sit in 44 minutes. Why would we want to go back to that? The opportunity is now is to think about what new thinking can happen. And I think what teachers need is they need permission. You know, they need permission to be able to say, you know what, that ineffective way I've been grading all these years, it needs a makeover. Okay, and I'm gonna get resources in terms of how we do that. I mean, I was struggling today saying I would hope our teachers, and I would say this across the whole country, that if a child is doing virtual, that after completing virtual class, I hope they don't have an assignment after that, because I think just being on a computer and enough to be graded on. And so I think what I gave our goals today was, and that permission is to go back and have those hard conversations with your staff, to be able to bring something back that I can take back to the school board and say, look, this is how we're going to re-engage kids. But I want to make a point, and I don't know whether it was Pam or Joseph said it, they probably both did, but there are a few kids that actually are doing pretty well in this virtual environment. We had a high school girl who was behind in credits that actually knocked out all her graduation requirements, and we were able to her diploma. About the kids who have high anxiety and they're worried about being bullied. Well, guess what? I don't think they're worried about that right now. So I think we're going to go back in what our education systems look like. I know what we're saying is, if we've got kids that 100% virtual, we're going to deny them that. We're just going to find a way to happen for them. So I guess I'm encouraged to hear that whether it's in Missouri or Maine, that even in rural Wisconsin, hey, we're sharing the same issues.
Yeah. I would just add in that you made me think about something, and that teachers, right? Teachers are the backbone work, and most of my ideas come from teachers, right? Because that's important to often have conversations with them about what they are experiencing, because they're the ones front line. And most of me saying is because I've heard it from some of our and parents, teachers as well. That's really important. That there's like lots of folks who are struggling, but there are also folks who are doing well. And so, how do we pull those bright spots out and learn from them? Like, we can't wait until it doesn't take 4 years, maybe. Like you said, they can do it in 3 years or sooner. And who's to say they can't get a 4-year degree before they graduate from high school? That's a novel idea, right? I mean, it's happening. And so we have to get out of the way as adults who are used to this traditional way of doing things, and open the door for possibilities. Because our kids are tough, and we can go with them, or they can run us over. I just wanted to give a shout out to teachers, because they're the backbone.
They are the.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and I would say that the other piece of this is they're sharing more. They're coming out of their individual spaces and they're sharing what's working. So they're really working like a professional learning community, or at least my small district is, and sharing ideas. And I think that's a huge step forward for all education, if they can share what works and with each other. And I do want to get back to the principals and how we're supporting them, because as I said, I kind of play that role here at the high school, and I have 2 other principals, one in each building, and I check in with them regularly because it is a very emotional time. Not only are our students at risk, but our teachers feel from everything from this is a pandemic to I'm terrified to be here, I don't want to die. And it's really a lot of emotional work, because as a principal, everybody comes into your office and you're like the social worker for the teachers. They're sharing all of their fears and concerns with you, and the load gets pretty heavy in a hurry. So I think being available, and I'm available pretty much 24/7 to my principals. I probably shouldn't be, but I am, because I think they need it right now. And I'm responsive if they call me and say, one of my principals called and said, my teachers are feeling stressed. Can I hire a sub 2 days a week and let them sign up for an extra hour of prep time? Yes, nice idea. Good, go ahead and do it. So trying to respond to the needs and the ideas they bring forward. And lastly, I would just say about teachers and principals, listen. Like, that's the key to it, is to understand what they're going through, how they're feeling. And they don't necessarily need me to solve all the problems, but they need me to hear them and then help them to solve them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for touching on these 2 very important points. And they get to 2 questions we had planned for later. One of them was around like how the role of the principal has changed during the pandemic, and what university preparation programs can do to help them weather through the pandemic and the national reckoning we're having over race. And the second was about social emotional support. The last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about SEL, and districts have been focused on that. But it was geared mostly towards students, right? Not so much staff and principals and teachers. And right now, everybody in the system needs support. So I just threw 2 questions at you. So I'm going to disaggregate them. The first one was about how the role of principals have changed, and what supports there are for them, and how universities can help them. But also, are districts prepared, and what are you doing to help principals with their own, social emotional well-being, given the challenging times in which they're leading?
Well,
I'll take a stab. Go ahead, Joseph.
No, you please, Wendell.
Okay. I guess I know I can speak more on the social emotional supports, but when I think about how this role has changed for principals, and I think if there's one thing that I've changed is now I put them in charge of the leadership team meetings. They're not my meetings. I say, leave me a little space. I've got some updates, whether it's from the board or whatnot, but I let them plan the meetings, and then regularly without me. Okay. And then there's usually one or two that kind of serves as a contact person, say, hey, we're in here discussing this. What do you think about this? And again, kind of that what Pam's talking about of just always being available for them. But I think the role has changed. I'm not so sure universities are ready to provide what's needed until they actually can come and learn about what it is they're going through. I think before you can say, hey, we can provide this, it can't just be a course, but I think you have to come and you got to listen. I mean, the stories that I get from my principals, I mean, they're sounding boards, as you just mentioned, and they're like, well, who's checking on me? And it's like, well, I do check on you. Okay. But again, what they're carrying, the weight of not just the children, but of the staff. And to me, I think principals are real vulnerable now, but going to that part on emotional supports, as we moved into an emphasis on social emotional learning for our children this year, we backed it up and we said, before we do social emotional learning for kids, we do it with the staff first. And so we went through social emotional learning and around our professional development. And some of our staff really struggled with it because it was like, well, wait a minute now. I have to put this out there. And I think what we're really trying to say to them is it's okay to be vulnerable. Our kids need to see us be vulnerable. And I think now that as we started social emotional learning with staff, it's helped them now because now as they're starting to build relationship with kids and look at the whole child, they have to look at themselves too. So I'm glad that we did take the route of starting professional development around social emotional learning, and we picked the book and we set up a Google Classroom around SEL. And I guess maybe what term we always talk about is not so much SEL, but it's like how do we give people that time to just get away or reflect, self-care. I mean, that's what we're really trying to focus on. But I know this is a big change for our staff. I know they're going to certainly tell us what's not working. So I'm encouraged that we are focusing on the SEL. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Wendell.
Yeah. I think the role of principals has changed tremendously. It's almost like principals are general contractors, and they're building a new house. And a general contractor doesn't have to, be an expert on anything, just to know a little bit about everything. But it's even nicer when they do. So if you have, someone who knows how to do electricity and they're also the general contractor, then they can certainly go deep around the electricity parts. What I'm saying is that, principals have to really learn how to lead as they learn. And that's something that's shifting. And one of the ways that we're going to have to continue to sort of change with the times is that we've got to engage schools of education, graduate schools of education that are preparing principals, right? Like those conversations have to be had between these graduate schools and school districts, because we're the practitioners and then they're the theorists, if you will. And so how do you bring theory and practice together in ways that responds to the time? This is a pandemic. Nobody in this lifetime and these generations have experienced it in the way that we have. So how do we learn from this? And then how do universities shift? So I think those conversations where you have the universities at the table and the schools, not just superintendents, but principals need to be at the table, and budding principals. The other part is, I think most people have I think that's a huge opportunity within school districts. How do we, when I was talking earlier about sort of that succession plan, how do we cultivate the next generation of folks who are going to take our place? How do we prepare them? And I think all of us have been doing some of that work, but I think it's now at the what will it look like later on, and then how do we as school districts in cooperation with these universities, because we've done a lot of work with UMSL, University of Missouri, and Washington, as having these conversations about what that role shift looks like. I try to flatten the role or the distance between the principal and I was a superintendent in a smaller district of about 2,000 students back in North Carolina, so I directly supervised them then, like Pam and Wendell do, and having a little bit of a larger district now, I have some principals, but I make it my business to be available to them, to be in schools, to do walkthroughs, to be in classrooms, to watch teaching and learning, because I think that's a part of my role. Like, I see myself more of a teacher than I do a superintendent. And I think principals have to do the same thing, is that you have to be a learner and be willing to fail. Doesn't mean you're a failure, it just means that something didn't work. And so you figure out how to make it work. That's how you learn. But this notion of, as we support principals, support their professional growth, but we also, as you know, have to think about their sort of self-care, if you will, as Wendell has said. Like, that self-care is really important. All of us are experiencing trauma in so many different ways. Whether we're working from home, like I still am on some days, and some days I'm in the office, or we're dealing with food insecurities in some homes, or domestic violence in other homes. I mean, there's so many issues that people are dealing with, and it can seem hopeless. And when you start feeling that way, it weighs on you. And we are always, principals in particular, are always taking care of other people. Well, who's taking care of them? And who's taking care of us, right? We take care of each other. Just quickly, I had a session. I meet with my cabinet every Monday morning, and I had a session last week that I learned this from a group we're working with on some ABAR work. And I just asked the question of our cabinet, and there's about 15 members on it. I said, so how do you go about self-care? And it was amazing, some of the things I heard, from yoga to just fixing dinner, to being home with my kids now, and they know who I am more because it's not just at night or whenever they're going to bed, and taking a walk, having a glass of wine with my spouse, or, those small things sometimes we take for granted, but also opportunities to be able to unpack my thinking so that somebody else, my wife may not want me to answer her question. She just may want me to listen to what she has to say just to get it out. It's cathartic. So I think really thinking about what self-care looks like, and then practicing that. And you can do it virtually. I was in one of my groups, and they had a drink that they had created, and it was a red colored drink. It was beautiful. I didn't make it, but everybody on the Zoom call did. And so we had some conversations about it, and we were on Zoom, and we had our drink, and then in a different one, we had made pancakes and had a breakfast one morning, and everybody had their pancakes in their own space, and then we just spent time together. I mean, those things may seem small, but they mean a lot when you can have someone to talk to and to help you through all this. So I think that, preparing principals and then supporting them in the process, I think is really important.
I would agree.
Pam, since you're the only one who's a principal.
I would say that in doing some research on principals not too long ago for my dissertation, it was noted as being one of the loneliest jobs is being a principal. And as a former principal and a current pseudo principal, it's one of those places where you have to be friendly to everybody, but you can't be friends with anybody. So you're in a role and you're trying to be equal but separate. And so I talked to 31 rural school principals in the last year and a half for my dissertation study. And time again, they talked about not having anybody to talk to not having a group of people or colleagues that they can turn to. So I'm still ultimately, even though I'm a principal and I have two other principals here and I work with them as principals, they also still know that I'm their superintendent and I evaluate them. So it still doesn't put a level playing field, even though I try to model, you need to take care of yourself, you need to have time with your family. I remember when I was in school to be a principal, I heard somebody say the last thing you want to do is work for a superintendent that's a workaholic, because they're going to expect you to work all the time. So I try to tell them all the time that I balance my life, that I go home, I have supper with my husband, I, play golf, I do the things that I enjoy doing. I also am a workaholic, but I keep that secret. I try to do that under the cover of darkness a little bit. But I think they also need to be connected to other people that have similar roles and issues. So like in Western Maine, we have a Western Maine Education Collaborative, and we've connected our Western Maine principals. So they meet once a month, and right now they're doing it through Zoom because they can't collectively get together. But typically they were meeting over breakfast, and it was no agenda. Just come, sit, talk, any topic that you had could come to the table. Because I do think sometimes they need peers that are equal peers and not just the superintendent to talk to. Because I remember as an early principal, I called my mentor and said, I'm in my office. I've been in every classroom. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I certainly wouldn't have called my superintendent and said that. So I think they do have to somehow be connected. If they're maybe in Joseph's district, they have enough principals, so they have a peer group. But in my district, there are 2 of them other than me. So to connect them to like-minded people dealing with the same type of situations in similar areas, I think is really powerful. And I know my 2 principals have said, I love those morning breakfasts. And I don't go because, again, it would tip the table to, I have my superintendent sitting at the breakfast with us. But I think if we can model self-care, talk about self-care, put it in our meetings with our principals so they see that we're putting it as a priority, so they can turn around and put it in a priority with their staff in their schools at their staff meetings. I think all of those things help to support that you can't help others unless you help yourself. It's the whole put your oxygen mask on first, and we have to keep saying it to them. Because this is an overwhelming situation. The emotions are high, because typically you're just kind of tamping down students and their emotions and behaviors, but now you're really tamping down your entire staff and your students and your families. It's a huge undertaking, and it has changed the principalship immeasurably, and we just need to support them in that change and know that relationships and self-care are what's going to sustain them through this.
Yeah, Pam got to another thing that we wanted to talk about before we go into the comments and see what questions the audience has for us. So it's been an incredibly challenging year for you, and you learned a lot. Can you talk a little bit, maybe just list one new thing that you learned during the last 9 months, and what did you have to unlearn? I'm really curious about what practices that you might discard after the pandemic because of what you experienced.
I'll be brief. I guess if there's anything I learned, it's Maslow before Bloom, and we had to take care of kids and their safety and their food insecurity before we can even think about educating them. And now that we're able to support those needs and we're slowly bringing them back to school, now we can start working on strengthening the relationship to get to the academic piece.
Is there one thing you know you won't do? Pam, go on.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I agree with that. I think I've always worked out of a place of relationships. And to me, through this whole pandemic, that has become immensely clear that whether we're in school or out of school, it really comes down to the relationships that we can build with each other and with our students. And that's going to be the success of our schools. I think, unfortunately, in Maine, and I'm not sure if it's across the nation, we have been so standards-based and data-driven that some of our teachers have given up kind of a little bit on the building relationships because they feel like they have to use every minute teaching a standard. And I think it's become crystal clear that we have to figure out what standards, yes, that we're going to teach, but ultimately it's about what relationships we build with our students and the kind of humanity that we move forward with, and not necessarily checking off the boxes that they know these standards. I think we're seeing people as people. Like we're in when you're Zooming with somebody, you are literally in their, you're how they live, you're feeling how they live. And I think it's brought a new humanity back to teaching. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's something that I want to make sure we hold on to post-pandemic teaching.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think mine aligns with what I've already said. But one I think, if I would call it new learned in this pandemic, really is race. And how some of my white brothers and sisters, you know, want to have that race conversation more than what I thought. You know, conversations I heard Pam earlier about Robin DiAngelo's book and Ibrahim K's book, you know, some things that have been written about race and how we navigate that space. I've been really pleasantly surprised about some of my white brothers and sisters and how they have engaged in that conversation about race. And I've had to unlearn the way I think about people who don't look like me. My experience was my lived experience and is who I am. But what I've also learned is that some of those what I had about people who don't look like me were tested and found to be untrue. That there's more than a single story. In fact, there's a danger in a single story, right? And that's been really nice because it's allowed me to be vulnerable and to approach race in a careful way, not necessarily delicate, just careful and sensitive, but also intentional. I think you have to have those conversations because we often think about race, whether you're Black or white or Native or Asian or Hispanic or biracial or whatever your ethnicity is, it's there. And we think about it. We may not call it out. We may not even ever talk about it, but we think it. If you know, one of you were asked to describe me, I'm sure big bald head Black man, it would be that I'm Black, right? And what my race is. And I think that we have to have the courage to have those conversations about race, and then to really talk about what assumptions we have about people who don't look like us, because that has been so inspiring for me. In fact, I feel that my relationships are deeper with some of my white brothers and sisters now because of the conversations that we're having about race. And I think as a country, we don't do a good job at having that conversation, not in a way that is productive. Right? Like we talk about it with people who look like us in behind closed doors. But how do we have those conversations in a way publicly and safely so that we grow from it? And it doesn't have to be public, just in a way that we are around people who don't look like us and have had different experiences than us. And I think that's been really nice to learn, because given this racism pandemic that we call that's out there and has been this deep-seated, and it won't go away if we don't deal with it. That we have to deal with that stuff. Otherwise, it continues on. And that to me has been probably one of the best things I've learned in the midst of this crisis that we've all been in. And I think that will help me as we go forward, which I think aligns with, you know, Maslow's before Bloom's.
Can we just take one moment and talk about the elections? The unresolved elections. What do you anticipate the national education priority and focus would be? Opportunities and obstacles do you see?
You know, I mean, I'll be happy to jump in. You know, I'm just excited in a lot of ways, whether I'm Republican or Democrat or who I voted for. What I do know is that we have been divided, and I feel like we'll be able to come together in a different way now, and I'm really happy about that part. But you know, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Black women and white women and Asian women and all women, because Kamala Harris is standing on a stage that no other woman or person has ever stood on. And that to me is worth a clarion call. For this Black Asian sister to stand there and will be leading as the first female vice president in history is just mind-blowing, and I'm excited about that. And I think that her perspective, Joe Biden's perspective, and the perspective that I think they bring and the people they will bring with them, I will feel included as a Black man in America. And that's exciting. And so I think this election will, especially with Jill Biden being an educator, I'm really excited about the possibilities that education has now, right? Like she's a teacher, and we need a teacher in the Department of Education, someone who knows what's happening in classrooms. So teachers get the respect they need and deserve. So this election to me is a door opener for what what was once impossible is now possible. So I'm excited about it.
Okay, it's tough to follow, but I'll start with Saturday night. I told my wife, I'm going to sleep well tonight because I haven't slept well for a long time. And I think that sleep was because of the hope that I felt in listening to President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris in terms of just to say, you know what, in order to get back to our economy, we've got to look at our schools differently. We've got to make sure that there is a plan to reopen our schools safely and the resources to go with it. And you know, when you and Joseph said it, when you have an actual teacher right in the White House, I mean, to me, I hope that sends a very strong message to educators. But I would echo the what was said also about women in leadership. You know, we've got more Native American women now in Congress. I mean, I really hope that this raises maybe the awareness level that, you know, we got to be ready as a country to embrace that and not fight it.
So I also agree that there's a certain measure of hope with this new president-elect, and I think the Biden-Harris educational platform, I think it is going to be backed by Dr. Biden, the First Lady. But I also, I liked some of the things I saw about wanting to support not the pay and the respect of teachers. I think it's about time that teachers are respected for the hard work that they do. And I think, unfortunately, the narrative on teachers in education has been poor for quite some time. I do worry still about the pay and being able to fund schools. I know in Maine, we've been hinted at looking at a 10% reduction in our ED 279s because of the shortfall from the cost of the pandemic. So I'm hoping that they take a close look at that. And I'm also super excited about the fact that the platform includes social work, psychologists for schools, and understanding the need to have those professionals in our school. I have a social worker in each of my 3 buildings. I really need more than one, but they're not even funded through the essential programs and services formula that's used. So those are on the backs of the taxpayers in our schools. And I think it's really important in time that we understand that we can't run schools without social work and mental health services within our 4 walls, because we have so many mental health needs for numerous reasons. And I think that alone, if that comes to fruition, could be a huge turning point for our schools. So I do have hope, but I'm a realistic Pollyanna. I am very hopeful, but I also understand that money could potentially be tight. And I think we just need to be really careful on how we proceed with that, because I know Maine just went to a $40,000 or moving to a $40,000 minimum teacher salary. And for some rural schools, it's really been a struggle. And do I think they deserve more than that? Absolutely. But we also have to build that structure carefully so that we're not undermining our communities while we're also lifting up education. And that seems an awful thing to say for me as a superintendent, but I do think we have to be careful on how we get there. But I am very hopeful and excited about the change that I think will be coming.
Yeah, and I would just add one piece, and to what Pam was just saying, because it made me think about, just being careful about moving forward. I think it's about what we make as a priority. When we can give out $2 and $3 trillion in a stimulus package, we can fund education. Money shouldn't be a question because, it's our priorities. Where do we place our priorities? And education, to me, is the highest priority. I mean, you talk about national security, healthcare, all those things. It is founded in education. And we have to make it a priority from the federal level and the state levels, right? And when we do, and we fund our schools and support our teachers, that's just the first part of it, right? Like, we've got to pay teachers so that they are not only respected, but can live a decent life, having worked so hard to get to the place that they are at. But then the other side of that is accountability now. Like, we've got to also hold people accountable, teachers and superintendents and principals, because we can't keep putting money into something and don't get the return from it, right? And so we've got to make sure that kids are getting the learning they deserve every year. I think that no teacher should make under $50,000 a year. I mean, we have teachers making $100,000 a year in our district. In Chicago public schools where I work, teachers made more than that. And they ought to. But we also have to have accountability in place so that we guarantee children who in third grade are ready for fourth grade and fifth grade and so on. So I think it's where we put our priorities. And again, back to the hope. I hope that's where we go, and that we place a high priority on it. We should place a high priority on security, national security, and other things. But education ought to be at the top, because who's at the top of the Pentagon, they had to go through good quality school. And I think we are the pipeline to that in public schools. So that's my view.
We had a question from the audience about how parents have helped teachers and principals do their jobs in this period. Does anyone want to take that? How parents have helped principals and teachers cope with their work?
Yeah, I think that parents have been the cornerstone because there's been, so parents have had to. I've had moms send me emails saying, "When are you going to send my kid, bring my kids back to school? This is too much," And then I get an email a little bit later, weeks later, from a same parent who has changed her tone because now she sees the connection. And I think some of the parents that we haven't had the opportunity to talk to in the past, we're getting more of those opportunities now. Not that we've talked to everybody, but I do think that for me, in my experience, parents seeing what quality looks like is really important, because then they can better hold students accountable when they're home doing that work, and the teachers and us accountable as we're helping them do that work. So I think parents have helped us a whole lot, especially those who have deeply engaged, right? Like, I know we still have some challenges that are out there, but the more parents know what it takes to master standards and what's like on a daily basis, the students will be the benefactors of that. And so my hat goes off to parents and the grandparents in particular, who in our community have been just a cornerstone to helping our students. I can't say enough about them.
And, I'm glad grandparents. Yeah. I had a story today from my middle school principal where at the Distance Learning Center, the parent came in, and I think the hope of the middle school child was, oh, you'll just drop me off and you'll come back later. Well, no, they stayed, and they were learning about, so I can tell when my kid is logging on and for how long. And so I didn't know that about the Google Classroom. And again, that wouldn't have happened if there wasn't an opportunity for the parent and the teacher to talk. And now all of a sudden, you got them both on the same page. And I think that's what's been missing, is we've been talking at parents okay? And we haven't been listening, and now we might have to forum to say, hey, you got to remember, parents are the first teachers, okay? They spend more time at home than they do at school. So let's beef up the resources in the home. So I couldn't add any more on what Joseph has already said.
And I was going to say I concur to that, and I'll concur to Wendell's, that I think parents, grandparents, daycare providers, they all have a better understanding of what's expected of school, and they have stepped up to be partners with us, except for those that have disappeared. But the rest of them really have been partners. And I think the other side benefit of that has been many emails from parents and grandparents to teachers, to myself, to principals saying, wow, I have a new appreciation. Just wanted to reach out and say thank you for all you're doing. It's really opened up a different line of communication than we had before. And I think the way Wendell said it, we're not talking at them, we're talking with them at this point. So they really have stepped up to be partners, which I think is really exciting, because that somehow had disappeared from our education. And I think we've got that back to this pandemic.
As we prepare to wrap up, I was wondering whether each of you can just say a few words about where you find joy or hope in the current context or climate.
I think we've covered some of that in this conversation. For me, it's odd because people say to me, I can't believe you're superintendent and principal. And really my joy started even more when I came into the principalship, because I get to see kids every day, and we're back in school. So even though we have 30% of our kids virtual, I still get to interact with kids every day. And my joy now, and always has been, in students and interacting with students and working with teachers to help forward movement. And I think through this pandemic, everybody has seen the struggle, but also has found joy in small pockets, and they're willing to really step out and share those joyous moments and embracing them. And I think there have just been so many emails and stories and conversations about joyful moments that I think people are realizing that you have to embrace every positive moment in your life every day. And that's just a different feeling. And it brings me a lot of joy to reflect on the end of the day, all of the positive things that we've done.
Joseph, would you like to go next?
Sure. I get a lot of joy. I'm the eternal optimist, if you will. I try to find the silver lining in every cloud. We're doing some work with Achievement Network out of Boston around anti-bias and anti-racism, and we're creating these anti-racism standards. And we have a very diverse group of people at the table conversing about what we think and believe ought to happen in our district. And that's been really exciting and brings me a lot of joy, because I get to hear other people's stories. And there's a power in listening to somebody else's story and their lived experience and how they make sense of it. Because often I think is my situation was the worst. And then when I hear someone else's, I look at them and say, how can they be so normal having gone through what they've been through? And then it makes me realize, well, I was fortunate. And so having those conversations have been really nice. And what also brings me joy is, looking at, our students, because they've been a part of this conversation as well, like the empowerment that I see in some of our kiddos. I mean, they are beginning to speak out, right? Like kids who ordinarily wouldn't be at the table having conversations. In some of our speaker series that we have on Fridays, or in panels that we have students who are coming to the table now. And if nothing else, for the first few or 3 or 4 times, they're listening. And then all of a sudden they start speaking out on Zoom, but they're finding their voice. And I'll just give a quick example of something that happened. And I'll just sort of paraphrase it. And this is going to sound small, but it's huge to me, given my lived experience. But we were having a conversation about athletics, and I love football, and we often talk to the kids about getting to Division I schools. The Big Ten, the SEC, ACC, and often what happens is students don't become eligible that first year because they haven't taken the right courses. And now we have a couple of students who have learned how to calculate their GPA and then make sure that they're taking the right courses so that they can become eligible. And then understanding the honors courses and AP courses carry more quality points, depending on where you are, that affect your GPA. That also is an open door to eligibility in NCAA. Now, that may sound small, but that's huge. And when you see the light go off in a child's head about what they can do, it's like, I want to get there. I want to be an NFL player, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a pharmacist. But now they can see the path, and it's like a light goes off. And you talk about joy, that brings me a lot of joy. Having a 15-year-old black son who is one of those people who's getting that joy now, or at least that light bulb going off, and other students, it's exciting for me as not only the superintendent but a father. It brings me a lot of joy, and I want that for every child. I mean, he's one of our students. He goes to school in Ferguson. I want for him the same. I want for all of our kids what I want for my own baby. So that's what brings me joy.
Wendell, we'd like to hear from you.
Sure. I guess my joy is seeing that the relationships being reconnected with our students, our staff, our paras, and because it's been a while, but to starting to see those connections is giving me a lot of. It's helping. My hope is what we've learned from this pandemic is to not go back to the things that weren't working before the pandemic hit. That is my hope, and I'm going to try to find a way to keep that message going in our community, that just because we've always done things that way doesn't mean we need to go back to that. So I'm going to be hopeful that we're going to carry that through.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much for spending so much time with us talking about what you've learned during the pandemic, the challenges and the opportunities that you see. And before we finally log off, did anyone have any parting or closing thoughts you wanted to share? Or you've been great.
Yeah, I just want to thank UCA for bringing us together. And then, I probably wouldn't have had a conversation with some of my new buddy now, Wendell, in Wyoming, or my new buddy, Pam, in Maine. And I think there is some power in bringing people together in this space. So I hope it continues. But I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. One wish I have is that when it's in Puerto Rico again, and we can physically go there, we all show up in Puerto Rico.
Well, thank you, and good luck this school year. Thank you so very much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thanks. You too.
Thanks. Bye.